Things you learn from Christian history number 11. Just because you shout louder doesn't mean you're right. Fundamentalism was a response to criticism, as was papal infallibility. But just saying something firmly and in a loud, determined voice doesn't change reality. Chapter 11. Mormons, Missionaries and Monkeys. Waiting for rapture. America provided a place where separatists could be free to dream their dreams and create their ideal societies. When a teacher and spiritual leader called Johann Georg Rapp, 1757 to 1847, was expelled from the German Duchy of Württemberg in 1805, he and 800 followers made their way to America, or as Rapp called it, the land of Israel. There, known as the Harmonites, they set up 3 model communities named Harmony, New Harmony, and Economy. These were attempts to build the New Jerusalem in Pennsylvania and Indiana. Similar communities were established by the Shakers, a community that lived a simple lifestyle of shared possessions, celibacy, worship, and fabulously beautiful furniture. They were led by a woman, the charismatic Mother Ann Lee. They emigrated to America in the late 18th century and built up more than 20 settlements, attracting over 20,000 converts during the next century. Their name was yet another nickname from shaking Quakers, a dismissive description of their ecstatic worship. The communities were celibate for the same reason that the Apostle Paul advocated celibacy. The end was nigh. The Harmonites even made specific predictions. Rapp believed that Napoleon was the Antichrist and that Jesus Christ would return on the 15th of September 1829. When Jesus rescheduled and failed even to leave a message, a third of their members left. There was discord among the Harmonites, but elsewhere, in a remote farming community in Vermont, William Miller, 1782 to 1849, pored over his King James Bible and discovered the truth. The second coming would happen on the 22nd of October 1843. When the date came and nothing happened, he recalculated and announced that it was due in 1844. He and his followers gathered in the desert and nothing happened. The non-event was given the rather depressing title of The Great Disappointment. Miller returned to Vermont to work out what had gone wrong. He took with him a better abacus and a group of true believers in the advent of Christ, including a visionary teenage prophetess called Ellen G. Harmon. Her 2,000 visions and keen fondness for vegetables and roughage formed the basis of a new movement, the Seventh-day Adventists. They celebrated the Sabbath on Saturday, as the Jews did, and one of their benefactors was a man called Dr. Kellogg, who put Ellen's ideas on roughage into practical and profitable form. They proved to be a fractal denomination of endlessly splintering subsets. One Millerite group was the Jehovah's Witnesses, pacifists who predicted that the War of Armageddon would start in 1914. What happened in 1914 certainly had some revelation-like qualities, but it was not the end of the world. Then they moved the date to 1925, then 1975, then, well, you get the idea. Second comings are like buses. There will always be another one due in a minute. The Plymouth Brethren began in Dublin, sometime around 1828. They had a touch of the Quakers about them, rejecting all church traditions and employing no leaders. Everyone was allowed to preach and administer the sacraments, apart from women, obviously. One of the leaders of the Brethren was John Nelson Darby, 1800 to 1882, a former Anglican who developed a growing interest, you might say an obsession, with revelation and the idea of the end times. He invented 2 theories. The first was based on Matthew 24, 36 to 44, where Jesus describes his return and how one man would be whisked away while another would be left behind. Unable to read the passage in any way other than literally, Darby came up with the idea of the rapture, where on Christ's return believers would be suddenly lifted up. Christ would then rule the earth for 1,000 years from his base in Israel. This is, of course, our old chum, the millennium. Having failed to turn up for its own party in 1000, and then 1030, and then in 1666, apocalypse obsessives began ever more torturous and detailed analyses of Revelation to work out what was going on, or wasn't going on. Naturally, they splintered into many different groups, but there were 2 main strands of interpretation. Darby's came to be called premillennial, from the idea that Christ's return would precede the millennium. The opposing view, based on earlier interpretations, which was held by Jonathan Edwards, among others, was that the second coming of Jesus Christ would arrive after the 1,000-year golden age, rule of the saints. This is known as postmillennial. Another core idea of these groups was dispensationalism, the idea that God has divided human history into dispensations, historical eras of different kinds of divine activity. So there was the period of law in the Old Testament, followed by the era of grace. In the period of dispensation marked end times, there would be great tribulations, cataclysmic battles between good and evil, and at the end, Christ would come riding in like the cavalry to defeat Satan and establish the New Jerusalem. Darby's ideas are still very much in evidence. Just try typing the word rapture into Google. Actually, don't. The habit of predicting the end of the world is as popular and as wrong as ever. And the one thing all these groups have in common is that they have all been proved wrong. The Book of Mormon. Perhaps the strangest mutation of apocalyptic thought is British and American Israelitism, which identified Britain and the USA as the lost tribes of Israel. The British Israelites believed that the British monarch was descended from King David, and the coronation stone in Westminster Abbey is actually the same stone on which Jacob laid his head when he saw his famous ladder. Their founder, Edward Hine, predicted that Britain would never fight a war with Germany, and also that the two nations would always preserve a strict Sabbath. So far, not only have we fought Germany twice, but every Sunday we shop at Aldi and Lidl. It's batty, the idea of the British Israelites, but it wasn't a new idea. There was something about America that reminded people of the Promised Land. The early Puritans believed they were building a holy kingdom. "We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us," wrote the Puritan John Winthrop. The imagery of the Promised Land filled their rhetoric. The separatists identified with the ancient Hebrews. The New World was the new Canaan. George Washington was the American Joshua. When it came to designing the nation's new Great Seal, Benjamin Franklin wanted a picture of Moses dividing the Red Sea, while Thomas Jefferson proposed the pillars of fire and smoke. If they were the new Israel, then the Native Americans were the Canaanites. God had given the land to his people, now the chosen had to drive the enemy out. Among those who took this idea to extremes was a man called Joseph Smith, who had a visit from a Native American, a Jewish Native American, a dead Jewish Native American. The spirit, whose name was Moroni, returned from the dead to tell Smith that the Native Americans were really the lost tribes of Israel, who had come to America in 600 BC. Smith translated history using a pair of magic spectacles, and the result was the Book of Mormon, the name of Moroni's father. Smith and his followers moved west, where he announced that polygamy was allowed and declared himself a candidate in the 1844 presidential election. When a local newspaper published an expose of Smith, he organized a bunch of disciples to shut it down by force. This angered the governor, who sent in the troops and arrested Smith and his brother. On the night of 27th of June, 1844, an armed mob stormed the jail and shot them dead. Whether it was because of the newspaper, or because Smith had nicked all the women, isn't clear. These are just a few of the many new denominations, sects, and brands of Christianity available in the Land of the Free, registered trademark. Small print, full membership of Land of the Free does not include slaves or Native Americans. Terms and conditions may apply. The increasing emphasis on personal conversion, being born again, brought opposition in the mainstream churches. But the American dream, people's gung-ho, you can do it philosophy, meant that instead of submitting to authority, people just headed off to start their own church. There was something for everybody. Let my people go. Not everyone welcomed American independence. When the British withdrew from Georgia, a man called George Lisle, 1750 to 1820, decided to go with them. It wasn't that he wasn't keen on liberty. On the contrary, going with the Brits was the only way he could be sure of staying free, because George was an ex-slave, and he figured that if he stayed in the American South, he would be taken back into slavery. George had been freed by his Baptist master Henry Sharp, who recognized George's gift of preaching. After his release, he and his family spent time in Savannah, Georgia, where he helped lead a Baptist congregation. In 1780, he went to Jamaica with his wife and 4 children. He was the first black missionary. His preaching gathered many followers, and he was able to found a church of some 350 people, including some white attendees. He was helped financially by British supporters. But the British authorities in Jamaica were not quite so keen. They kept a close eye on him and censored his sermons and even his prayers. The liberation of America was not extended to its slaves, who were almost universally regarded as a subhuman species. Indeed, There were questions asked as to whether they were even worthy of baptism. Admittedly, there was that bit in Paul about there being no difference between slave and free, but you could get around that by reading it really quickly and hoping no one would notice. One would expect that people kept in such a situation would reject everything about their oppressors. But one of the amazing things about Christian history is that the slaves adopted the faith of the white men. They co-opted it, subverted it. They looked into the Bible and saw the real story, a story of Exodus, of powerful overlords brought down and the nation released from slavery. They turned these stories of release into songs, spirituals, that used biblical code language to share their hopes that one day they would be released. In 1800, the slaves revolted in Virginia, led by a blacksmith called Gabriel, 1776 to 1800. He and 25 followers were hanged. He's only 24 when he died. In reaction, Virginia and other state legislatures passed repressive new laws, which prohibited the education of slaves and curtailed their rights of assembly and free speech. You can see why they were worried. Around 40% of the population of Virginia were slaves at the time. Gabriel had ordered his followers not to kill any Methodists or Quakers, both of which groups were vocal in their opposition to slavery. 30 years later, a slave called Nat Turner led a slave revolt that killed 60 whites. He was captured and hanged along with at least another 100 blacks during the uprising, with many more killed or beaten during the mob reprisals that followed. What was interesting about Nat was that he was a devout Christian. He was often seen reading his Bible, and he experienced visions that he believed were messages from God. He also led Baptist services among his fellow slaves. Services were generally seen as ways of controlling the slaves, endorsing the status quo and preaching the virtues of obedience. But this approach was dangerously double-edged, and many Christians were involved in helping slaves to escape. One of the best-known escape routes was via the so-called Underground Railroad, a resistance movement and network of safe houses by which slaves from the South could find their way to northern free states, or to Canada. By 1860, according to the US Census, there were nearly 4 million slaves in service. In the end, it took the bloodshed and horror of the American Civil War to bring an end to slavery in the USA. Suddenly, over a third of the population of the southern states of the Union, previously enslaved, were set free. Their reward was lives of poverty, unemployment, and ongoing racial segregation.